I've been sitting with a specific image for about 3 years now. Not a photograph, not a painting. A newspaper clipping from the Ohio Democrat, January 14th, 1870, describing the excavation of an enormous iron helmet found near West Hickory, Pennsylvania. Nobody dug it up looking for a story. They were building a derrick. The helmet was corroded with rust and far too large to fit any man the workers knew. They didn't call a museum. They didn't call a scientist. They stood there, reportedly, holding this thing between them, unable to explain the scale of what was sitting in their hands. That clipping should have launched a career's worth of academic investigation. Instead, it sits in an archive that almost no one visits, catalogued under nothing in particular, filed between livestock auctions and weather reports. I keep coming back to one simple question. What kind of head was that helmet made for? That question, that specific, quiet question about scale and proportion, is what this is really about. Not monsters, not mythology. About a pattern of physical evidence scattered across continents and centuries that official history has consistently chosen to explain away rather than to actually explain. I want to be clear about something before we go further. I am not here to tell you that giants walked the earth in the storybook sense. I have no interest in sensationalism or fairy tales. What I am interested in is the gap between what the records actually show and what we have been taught to believe about those records. And that gap, when you start measuring it carefully, is significant. Not because every account is credible, not because every anomaly requires a supernatural explanation, but because the pattern of erasure, the records that vanish, the investigations that never begin, the institutions that go silent, that pattern is as real as any artifact. Let's begin with what the establishment says, because the official position deserves to be heard fully and fairly. The mainstream view is not unreasonable, and the people who hold it are serious. Giants are mythological constructs. Every culture on Earth produced stories of enormous beings because human imagination uses scale naturally as a symbol of power. The Greek Gigantomachy, the Norse Jotnar, the Nephilim of Hebrew scripture, the Rakshasas of Sanskrit tradition, these are explained as narrative tools, ways of encoding fear and admiration into cultural memory. The scholars who study this are careful people. Their explanations are internally consistent. They've thought about these questions longer than most of us have been alive. And when it comes to physical remains, the giant skeletons reported throughout 19th century newspapers, the mainstream explanation is equally thoughtful. Hoaxes, misidentification, journalistic exaggeration, and the well-documented tendency of that era's press to print sensational content without verification. The Cardiff giant is offered as the defining example. That explanation is correct about Cardiff. George Hull commissioned the statue, buried it on his cousin's farm, and waited for workers to find it. The hoax was exposed within months. The mainstream uses this as the template for dismissing everything else in the record. That part I genuinely understand. But here is the first thing that doesn't fit cleanly. Not in a dramatic way. Just quietly, the way a door doesn't close properly, and you keep coming back to it. In the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, a peer-reviewed medical publication, not a tabloid, from June 19, 1856, there is a report from Burlington, Iowa. Workers excavating the cellar of Governor Grimes's building uncovered an arched vault roughly 10 feet square. Inside were 8 human skeletons. The journal describes them as being of, and I'm quoting directly, gigantic proportions. This is a medical journal. In 1856, the language is clinical, not theatrical. The account is not illustrated. It carries no dramatic headline. It appears under medical intelligence, between surgical technique discussions and pharmaceutical notes. It reads the way a medical record reads, matter of fact, brief, and with no apparent commercial motivation. That is not the profile of a hoax. Now, and this is important, I can hear the rational objection. Gigantic proportions is subjective. 19th century standards of height were different. Malnourishment was widespread, and a 6-foot skeleton among a population averaging 5'5" might have seemed enormous to those men. I take that seriously. I genuinely do. But the Iowa record is not alone. It is not even unusual. The Weekly Times of Hartford, Tennessee, March 30th, 1872, carried a report titled Race of Giants Found in Underground Tomb under Old Stone Fort in Tennessee. Across different states, different publications, different years, the same kind of account keeps appearing. This is where the shape of the investigation shifts, because one account is an anomaly, two accounts are a coincidence. But when you spend real time in these archives, and I have spent considerable time in them, you stop counting coincidences at some point and start asking a different kind of question altogether. The pattern is not only American, that's what makes it harder to dismiss. In Siberia, Russian expedition journals from the 1840s reference excavations yielding skeletal remains of unusual height encountered during infrastructure surveys along the Upper River Basin. Those reports were compiled by government cartographers. They weren't trying to sell newspapers. In Prussia, municipal excavation records from 1831 reference the discovery of a burial site near Magdeburg containing armoured remains described by the surveying officer as inconsistent with known historical proportions. The armour was noted as functional, not ceremonial. It was built to accommodate a frame significantly larger than the soldiers of that era. There are accounts from Ottoman survey records in the 1850s, from British colonial dispatches in the Punjab through the 1860s, from Chilean mining reports in the 1880s. Different governments, different languages, different institutional purposes, and in each case, large skeletal remains noted briefly, catalogued without emphasis, and then never mentioned again. What these accounts share is not dramatic language. What they share is brevity. These are not accounts written by people trying to convince you of something. They read like men who stumbled onto something they didn't understand and decided the professional thing to do was note it and move on. I want to pause here because intellectual honesty requires it. The argument from Patton is a genuinely dangerous one. The human mind is extraordinarily good at finding patterns where none exist. It is one of the oldest documented cognitive biases we carry. I am aware of this. It matters deeply. It's possible I'm selecting accounts because they fit a thesis I formed before I was careful enough. It's possible each of these has a mundane forensic explanation that an anthropologist could give in 30 seconds. I cannot rule that out. I want that on record before I go any further. What I can say is this. I looked for the follow-up investigations. I looked for the academic responses, the institutional rebuttals, the papers that engaged seriously with these accounts. In almost every case I found nothing, not a refutation, not even an acknowledgement. The accounts simply ceased to exist in the subsequent literature. That is not evidence of suppression on its own. Journals didn't cover everything. Archives are incomplete. Researchers have finite time and finite funding. I know all of this, but there is a difference between incomplete coverage and systematic invisibility. And what I kept finding was not gaps in an otherwise continuous record. It was silence. Let me shift the angle. Because the physical evidence is not only skeletal, the architectural record carries its own questions, And those questions do not depend on bones that may or may not have been exaggerated. They depend on measurements, and measurements don't change depending on who's doing the describing. The doorways. This comes up constantly, and I resisted it for a long time because it seemed too simple. But the original functional buildings of the early 1800s, the garrison halls, the administrative chambers, the practical military infrastructure, many of them feature door frames that exceed 14 feet in their original construction. The standard explanation is aesthetic. Grand proportions expressed power and authority, and governments wanted to seem imposing. That is credible for ceremonial spaces, but garrison halls and military storage facilities of that era were not built to impress visiting diplomats. They were built to move men and equipment efficiently. There are military stables from the early 1800s in Eastern Europe, documented standing structures, where the stall dimensions would comfortably accommodate an animal considerably larger than any horse breed we have on record. The stalls were not modified later, they were built that way originally, and no one has offered a compelling explanation. Several museum collections in Central Europe contain bladed weapons from the pre-1800 period, catalogued as ceremonial or decorative, that are impossible to wield at standard human proportions. The weight, the handle geometry, the reach required to use them effectively, none of it fits a body we would recognize as ordinary. Ceremonial is the word that keeps appearing. Every time an artifact is too large, too heavy, or too geometrically inconsistent with known human anatomy, the classification ceremonial appears, and the question closes. It is a useful word. It has ended more investigations than any formal prohibition could have managed on its own. Now I want to bring this closer to the specific Tartarian question, because everything I've described so far exists in the general record. But when you look specifically at the territories identified on pre-1800 maps as Great Tartary, the density of these anomalies changes. It becomes noticeably harder to explain away. The maps are real, this is not in dispute. European cartographers from the 16th through the 18th centuries consistently marked a vast territory stretching from the Urals to the Pacific as Tartaria or Tartary. The region was acknowledged, studied, and categorized in French, Dutch, British, and German cartographic traditions with remarkable consistency across institutions. What the maps do not tell us, and what historical literature conspicuously avoids, is the nature of the military force that held that territory. A region spanning roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface would have required an extraordinary defensive and administrative apparatus. The question of who guarded it is almost entirely absent from the record. The Russian imperial expeditions of the 18th and early 19th centuries, which produced detailed ethnographic records of the Siberian interior, occasionally reference local oral traditions describing former warriors of unusual stature who defended the region during a period of catastrophic upheaval. The expedition authors noted these traditions and moved on without inquiry. They moved on because oral tradition is not evidence. I understand that. I was trained to think the same way. You don't build a historical argument on what indigenous informants told expedition officers 150 years ago. The academic reasons for that caution are legitimate, hard-won, and I'm not dismissing them. But here is what I cannot stop thinking about. The oral traditions of the Siberian interior, collected by Russian ethnographers with no contact with West African griots, Polynesian navigational traditions, or Norse saga scholars, describe warriors of the same scale, the same function, and the same disappearance, independently, without coordination. This is the part that I find most difficult to explain away. Not the individual accounts, not even the accumulating pattern. It is the coordination problem that I keep returning to, because it is genuinely hard to solve with the tools available to conventional historiography. Imagine you want to construct a false history. To remove the giant soldiers from the record entirely, you would need to simultaneously coordinate suppression across newspaper archives in 15 countries, museum reclassifications across 4 continents, and modifications to dozens of independent oral traditions all at once. You would need to reach inside Ottoman survey departments and British colonial offices and Prussian municipal archives and Chilean mining companies, institutions that were competing politically, many of which were actively at war with each other, and convince all of them to tell the same silence, at the same time, in the same way. No single conspiracy achieves that. No shadow government coordinates across hostile imperial powers in real time. So I don't think that's what happened. What I think, if I'm being careful, is that the silence organized itself through something more ordinary and more disturbing, shared institutional interest in a stable, manageable narrative. Institutions, governments, universities, museums, churches have a common investment in what historians call periodization, the tidy division of time into manageable, teachable chapters. A warrior class of outsized physical capability doesn't fit the chapter. It disrupts the story of gradual human progress. Disruptions to the story get filed quietly under mythology and left there. Nobody has to issue an order. Nobody has to burn a document. All that has to happen is for enough respectable people to raise an eyebrow when someone mentions the Burlington vault, and the person asking learns, without being explicitly told, that this is not a career-advancing line of inquiry. That process, the quiet professional cost of asking the wrong question, is how most inconvenient knowledge disappears, not through dramatic suppression, through the accumulation of raised eyebrows and redirected funding and papers that don't get published because reviewers cannot figure out what category to put them in. I want to stop here and be honest about where this argument becomes dangerous. There's a version of it that turns unfalsifiable. If evidence appears, it supports the theory. If it's absent, it proves suppression. That is not a sound epistemic position, and I've spent considerable time trying to make sure I'm not standing in it. The honest answer is that I cannot prove suppression. What I can demonstrate is a pattern of non-investigation, a consistent institutional failure to follow up on accounts that, in any other context, would have demanded immediate scientific inquiry. The absence of follow-up is itself a data point. That distinction matters. So let me make the argument more precisely. Not giants existed, but something existed. A military class, a human population with biological characteristics significantly different from the baseline, that held and defended the Tartarian territory, and that was systematically absorbed, eliminated, or reclassified after the events of the early 19th century. There are precedents for this kind of biological divergence. The Nilotic peoples of East Africa, the Dinka, the Nora, regularly produce adult males above 6.5 feet in height, with body proportions that appear across their architectural and tool traditions. Biology and environment produce significant variation within our species. A population with access to the resources of the Tartarian territory, an extraordinarily mineral-rich region spanning temperate and subarctic zones, experiencing selective pressure toward physical size over many generations, is not a biological impossibility. It does not require a supernatural explanation. It requires only time, environment, and a reason to grow large. The reason to be large in a defensive civilization of that scale is obvious. You are guarding a territory the size of a continent. The distances, the terrain, the winters, the scope of the military challenge, all of it would select over generations for physical endurance, size and strength in the people responsible for holding the borders. And then something happened. Something in the early 1800s, whether a catastrophic environmental event, a military defeat, a biological collapse, or some combination, ended that civilization with a speed and completeness that the conventional historical record does not account for. The map disappeared. The people disappeared. The warriors disappeared. Together, the newspaper accounts are worth returning to because their timing tells a story of its own. The reports of giant skeletal discoveries in North American newspapers peak sharply between 1860 and 1890, then drop almost entirely after 1910. That is not a gradual decline as journalism matured and standards improved. That is a stop. Between 1880 and 1910, the Smithsonian Institution was formally established, expanded, and given federal authority over the collection and classification of anthropological remains across the United States. The timing of the newspaper silence and the institutionalization of federal anthropological authority occupy the same 30-year window. I am not claiming causation, I am noting proximity. What the Smithsonian did with certain remains from that period is in many cases not fully traceable. The institution acknowledged in congressional testimony related to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act that significant quantities of skeletal material were received, catalogued, and subsequently lost or unaccounted for. That acknowledgement is in the public record. I want to be precise here because this point is easy to overstate. The Smithsonian's record-keeping problems are real, but not necessarily conspiratorial. Large 19th century institutions were administratively chaotic, underfunded, and poorly documented by modern standards. Losses happen, that is true, but the losses appear concentrated in specific categories of remain. Here is a counter-argument I take seriously. Confirmation bias in the archive. If you go looking for accounts of large skeletal discoveries, you will find them because 19th century newspapers printed enormous quantities of sensational content, and not all of it was true. The volume of historical print means almost anything can be found if you search for it. That is a real caveat, and it is why I've tried to limit myself to accounts appearing in non-sensational contexts, medical journals, government survey reports, municipal excavation records, rather than in the penny press. The filter is imperfect, but it is a filter, and it changes the evidentiary weight considerably. Let me come back to the physical evidence one more time, because it is the hardest thing to dismiss. The Munich ethnographic collection contains several pieces catalogued in the 1870s as decorative Central Asian metalwork that were later studied by a conservator who noted their functional construction. They were not decorative. The scale of that armor, if worn as designed, would require a figure approximately 8 to 9 feet tall and proportioned accordingly. The conservator's notes are in the archive. They are not secret. They are simply never cited, because citing them opens a conversation that no one in the institution wants to have professionally. There is similar material in collections in St. Petersburg and in a provincial museum in Yekaterinburg. In both cases, functional armor, unusual scale, classified as ceremonial, and professionally untouched since the initial cataloguing decades ago. The objects sit, the notes sit beside them. Nothing moves forward. I am not saying the curators are lying. I don't think they are. I think they are doing what any reasonable professional does when faced with something that has no comfortable category. They file it correctly, use the closest available classification, and leave it for someone else to revisit someday. And nobody does. The oral traditions are the last thread, and I want to handle them carefully because they are the most easily dismissed. Across the indigenous peoples of the Siberian interior, the Evenki, the Yakut, the Buryat, there exist consistent traditions describing what translators have rendered as the Tall Ones or the Old Protectors. These traditions describe beings who preceded the current population, who were physically distinct, and who disappeared during an event encoded as a darkening, a period of cold, ash and prolonged silence followed by long years of recovery. The Tartarian nuclear winter hypothesis, the year without a summer in 1816, falls directly in that temporal window. The year without a summer is documented history, the result of the Tambora eruption, which reduced global temperatures and caused crop failures across the northern hemisphere. What is not fully documented is its effect on the Tartarian interior, which was simultaneously being administratively erased from European cartographic records. An already isolated population, a catastrophic climatic event, a systematic removal from official maps, and an oral tradition that describes exactly this sequence: cold, silence, disappearance in the same territories we are discussing. I cannot prove these things are connected, but I cannot find a reason either why they wouldn't be. The question I come back to most often is not where the warriors came from, it's where they went. Civilizations fall, populations collapse, genetic traits dilute over generations. All of that is ordinary history. What is not ordinary is the completeness of their disappearance from the institutional record afterward. When the Roman legions disbanded after the fall of the Western Empire, we have decades of documentation: the pay records, the land grants, the administrative reorganizations, the accounts of soldiers returning to provincial farms. The machinery of dissolution is visible and detailed. It left traces in every kind of archive it touched. The Tartarian warrior class, whatever its actual physical characteristics, left no such dissolution record. There are no demobilization papers, no land grants to oversized veterans, no administrative records of a military force being absorbed into successor states. The record does not show their defeat, it shows their non-existence. Those are different things. They were not defeated and documented. They were not absorbed and recorded. They were simply removed from the frame, the way a careful editor removes a character from a narrative whose continued presence complicates the story going forward. You don't see the deletion, you only notice much later that something is missing. I've been working on this for a long time, long enough to move through the stages that this kind of research tends to produce. Initial excitement, then skepticism of the excitement, then careful re-engagement with specific evidence, then a quiet unease that doesn't resolve into certainty, but also doesn't go away. The unease is specific. It is not about whether giants existed in some mythological sense. It is about something more precise, the possibility that the military history of a pre-reset civilization has been so thoroughly removed from the record that we are arguing about shadows on the wall and not even sure the wall is there. Every archive I've spent time in has this quality. There is the record that exists, and then, just at its edge, a set of conspicuous absences, not gaps where information was never generated, but spaces where something was clearly present and is no longer there. You can feel the outline of what's missing.